Welcome back, everyone, to this week's episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. My name is Matthew Westfox. I'm one of your hosts. My other normal co-host, Paul Hoppy, can't join us this week because he's traveling across country. But I'm really excited because our friend Adam Hulse is going to be joining us. And we're going to be talking about a topic that I know Adam was really excited to dive into. We're going to be talking about the idea of what does it mean to be a hero. Obviously, we talk a lot about the ethics of superhero shows. But I know Adam had been really excited about this idea of what does it actually mean to be a hero in our own world, and how are all these superhero TV shows and movies kind of helping us blur the lines a little bit about what does it mean to be a hero. So Adam, why don't you start by just saying hello and introducing yourself?
Hi, everybody. Matt, thanks for having me on your podcast. It's pretty cool. I heard a lot about this. I'm definitely overdue to listening to you and Paul talk about these things. I remember when we were kids, we talk about all the superhero stuff a lot.
Definitely. Me, Adam, and Paul all grew up together, so that's where it comes from.
Yeah. So, like all you guys, I've been watching a lot of the TV shows, and back in the day, I was a comic book fan. I still am, and I read all fantasy, all the different types of superhero books, and I just really been noticing that, like, in the effort to make Marvel or DC movies more and more better and real and everything like that, people are gravitating to them more as opposed to the subculture when we were kids.
Right.
So I've noticed, like, it's amazing, like, how many people are out there wearing those tight, broad chest Batman shirts, Superman shirts.
Yeah.
Obviously, as you know, you see all the toys and everything, and marketing is marketing. It gets bigger, but it kind of you also see how all these, like, actors are, like, using their personas to try to make a difference. And it kind of makes you wonder with the kids, how much are they actually trying to be like Captain America or like Tony Stark? Or do you know those types? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I was thinking about this actually over Thanksgiving because, I was talking with a family I don't get to see very often, and they were asking what I've been up to, and I told them about this podcast. And I mean, I've always been a little bit the odd duck in my family. They would have known that I was sort of into, like, that kind of stuff when we were kids, but I realized that they were all just super excited about the superhero genre and what I was talking about in a way that, I mean, my family is wonderful, but they're not geeky the way I think I and a lot of my other friends are. I don't think most of them grew up loving this stuff, and I was really struck by this. To me, Thanksgiving was really a sign of something I think I've seen before, that this stuff has gone mainstream. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, but so I think you're really onto something there in talking about it has gone a lot more mainstream, and what does that mean in terms of this hero question, and who are people looking to as heroes? And I want to dive more into that, but let me actually back up a bit and just start by, so for you, Adam, when you were a kid, who are the heroes you looked to? Or actually, let me even start a little bit before that. Like, to you, what do you think of as a hero? What did a hero mean to you when you were a kid?
Well, a hero to me when I was a kid is different than what I think now. It's like heroes when you were a kid is that type of character that you wanted to be like and you emulated.
Yeah.
Like, for me, I always associated with Spider-Man. A lot of other people were, I think you and Paul, definitely Paul was really into Batman back in the day. But I was, I really, and other people like Wolverine and X-Men. I was just Spider-Man, because Spider-Man I really associated with. He was a nerdy kid. Uh-huh. He was always funny, but he was always like, he wasn't like a Hulk guy. Like, he was very athletic, and it was just sort of like, and one of the things I remember always liking about him was, his ability to always, like, crack a joke no matter what the odds, and, like, he couldn't catch a break. And as I went, and as I got older, and going through puberty and all those things, definitely that feeling of not being able to catch a break was something I definitely associated with growing up. So Spider-Man was my hero growing up.
I can totally see that. I mean, I know for me, as I've talked about before, I got into some of the, like, I definitely was a Batman fan. For me, it was much more Star Wars than any of these things. And my hero, I think, was Han Solo. But in some ways, it was almost the flip side of what you're talking about. It was that feeling for me of Han Solo could just do anything and get out. He would always make the break. And And I think I loved him so much because I felt like the Peter Parker, like you're talking about. I felt like I could never catch a break. So I loved that character who always could.
Oh, sure. Right.
But I think that's a great point also, just like different people are going to be heroes to different people because so much of what makes the hero is who we identify with that way.
Right. And if you notice, like, I mentioned Spider-Man, but it was because of the comic books, not like Spider-Man and his Amazing Friends or those or those cartoons back in the day. Like today's technology and genre, people, the next generation, or I guess maybe 2 generations now, it's every 10 years, right? Something like that. I know. But, they connect to different types of things out there. Like, DC and Marvel tried over and over again to make all these types of movies. And it wasn't until, in my opinion, the Spider-Man movies with Tobey Maguire that they started to really hit on it. Yeah. There was all those cheesy 80s and 90s movies that didn't quite do so well.
Uh-huh. No, I definitely hear that. And so you talked about, like, that was your idea of a hero as a kid. So today, what do you think? How is your idea of what makes a hero changed?
I think it's the realism that they try to do in today's movies. Like they take real life scenarios and they insert these heroes into them, and so people can associate what's happening in the world with and could picture, these characters in there. Like I think the best place they really did that on a big scale was probably the first Iron Man movie, where he was in I don't know if they made up a country or not, but basically
it was Afghanistan. He was definitely in Afghanistan.
He was definitely in Afghanistan. And it was a war-torn country. He was a profiteer, but basically because he went through this horrible thing, he got a rite of passage and stopped making weapons, but he was still, as a kid of the next generation, you always like robots and guns and stuff. So he was like this smart guy in a war scenario who wants to make a difference, but he still had this, like, not Han Solo type, but this flamboyant type of thing. And he was also very real. I mean, Robert Downey Jr. did a good take on him and really captured the alcoholism. But I think they didn't use alcoholism; they just gave him just a lot of post-traumatic stress. But same idea.
Yeah, I mean, he was a real well-developed, not just like a really well-developed character, but he was he felt like a real person that someone could relate to, in large part because he had flaws. He wasn't the big blue Boy Scout that Superman's always portrayed as. Right.
And I feel like in terms of Captain America and Superman, people, I find it so fascinating because myself too, is like those 2 characters are the big blue Boy Scouts.
Yep.
And people are like, yeah, we're tired of the goody 2-shoes and everything like that. But if you attempt to change them, people like lose their minds.
Oh yeah.
They're like, it's like I remember when Superman died against Doomsday. I think I might have bought 2 Superman comics in my life. And when that happened, I bought like the whole series of what happened, and I was so mad that he died. And I was like, but then I didn't read his comics, but the idea that they were changing the what was going on there, and you can actually see it today because this whole thing with Captain America. And then, spoiler alert, but this whole thing, Captain America is maybe a secret Hydra agent and all this stuff.
Right.
Like if you read people on the net, people are like, this is nonsense. He was like, okay, it's nonsense, but how many comic books do you guys watch?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something so beautiful about what you said there, where you said, like, you were so angry about it that you bought comic books more than you ever had. I mean, like,
yeah.
I hate to think that's a motivational, but I mean, for that alone, that's a great reason for them to do it, to sell comics. But I also think you're right that there's a really interesting tension around, like this was the big debate over the first Zack Snyder, the Man of Steel movie. Like, they made Superman this dark, gritty character, and a lot of people, myself included, didn't like it because like he's supposed to be the big blue Boy Scout. And I'll admit, for me, there's a tension of I kind of want Superman to be the big blue Boy Scout, but that's also why I'm not very interested in most Spider-Man movies. I'm sorry, Superman movies. Because he isn't.
Right.
He isn't the Tony Stark. I mean, and even the Captain America, I think. With him, they've managed to do something really interesting because you're right, I think he's very similar to Superman, but what they've done is said, what happens when a person who stands up for all of these ideals that person stays the same, but kind of all the ideals fall apart around him, and so it's a new take on that idea of a hero, because it's, well, if you're the hero who's supposed to defend America, what happens when America isn't being America anymore,
Yes, and I think a lot of people associate with that right now, like, not to get too political, but I always find it as a different side of topics about, like, not, instead of like what defines it being a hero and stuff, it's like I had a conversation about a month or two ago, like what defines being patriotic.
Right.
And I've gotten like a dozen different answers. It's like, how do you associate with your country? And, Captain America, in his name itself is like, well, how does he act in this way? So I think a lot of people are really interested to see how Captain America handles similar situations to what's going on in today's society.
Oh yeah, and I think that's something they've done with Captain America in the past, and it gets into some really interesting questions of, if you are sort of the defender of a country, of an institution, what do you do when you feel like that the institution isn't living up to those values? And I think that I don't know the history of Captain America quite as well as others, but I do know that a number of times in his history, during Vietnam, or certainly during the Bush administration, or at other times, like when there was sort of a national sense of this country isn't living up to the values that Captain America would stand for, that he somewhat went against his own country,
Sure.
Because you get it, and I think in a lot of ways that the movie Civil War is a really interesting examination of that goes away from modern day politics, but is an interesting sort of metaphor for a lot of the stuff of, because in Civil War, Captain America, he's supposed to kind of be like the person who like follows orders and does what's right, but he's the one who breaks orders because he thinks the orders are wrong. And to me, that's a really interesting idea of heroism, because it's, what do you do when, as a hero, the people giving you orders are not giving you legitimate orders anymore?
See, I find that very interesting, because I think the movie Civil War, in terms of that aspect, actually did it better than the comics in giving that idea that Tony Stark's side could be right and Captain America's side could be right. Yeah. I mean, these people, in a very general sense, the powers of these superhumans it's not like commonplace like you get the idea in the comics. Like, these are people are like scared of these people, even though they're heroes. These guys are like living like weapons.
Oh yeah.
And they're basically saying, and Tony Stark's is like, we accidentally killed people. I'm not saying we shouldn't go save the day or fight against galactic things. Tony Stark says, I think the government should know where we are. It's like, but that's the slippery slope. And Captain America's like, no, I'm a person. Right. I shouldn't be put on a list. So, and I think that in the comics, it was much more about, there was like a disaster, I think, with the New Warriors, where they fought some guys and they killed a lot of innocent people. And then the government's like, all right, we got to register everybody. And it was much more about people going underground and not wanting to be registered. And then, eventually the Civil War happened. Right. But, the movies, I think they really captured the conversations between Tony Stark and Captain America really captured that well. Like, I actually sided both sides with them. I didn't just choose Captain America as a default.
Oh yeah, I mean,
I both sides.
This whole project, the blog started. The first thing that happened under superhero ethics was I actually published an article about why I am probably at the end of the day a little more Team Tony. Because like you, I see both sides. I think there's a lot of value to both, and Paul and I have kind of gotten into this a little because I know he's very much more Team Cap. But yeah, because I think that to me is really I think that movie was one of the best examples of a situation where there wasn't a clear good guy and a bad guy. Every side,
and people hate that.
Yeah, I know. Well, and let's talk about that a lot. Why do you think? Because to me, I love that, and that's what I want out of my hero movies. But why do you think people often why do you think people want much clearer ideas of good and evil and right and wrong?
Because it's not true in real life. Yeah,
because they want the kind of that escapist idea.
Yeah, I mean, a long time ago now, I ran a LARP, like a fantasy LARP, and I tried
it's a live action role playing.
Live action role playing, yes.
And it was
not
up to speed.
Yeah. Nerd Central, guys. But basically, the idea was, it was almost running like a improv theater because these people were all very good actors,
Right.
and running for years and years, so everyone knew their characters really well, and there was no script. I mean, I had a script, but they didn't. And but one of the things that I failed in doing as the owner and the head storyteller is that I really wanted to give a real sense of realism. So there was, there were lands and governments and wars and everything. And a lot of times people got really upset because sometimes there was no right answer. They couldn't just go slay the bad guy, or there was like a war going on that I gave background story that they could find out. And they're like, oh, let's go save the day. I'm like, no, it's 4,000 miles away.
Right.
And they got really pissed off that they couldn't do anything about it. And I'm like, well, this is just this is flavor text.
Right.
And I just remember how incredulous I was that people were angry that they got lore. Right. I was like, they're like, how dare you make me learn about the world? And I was like, oh, all right.
Well, but, I think you're really onto something there, though, because I think it speaks a lot to our ideas of what do we want a hero to be versus what do heroes wind up being. Because I think in some ways, I think for a lot of people, one of the things that a hero can be is escapism, and we do live in a world where, like you said, like there are a lot of things that if I look back on my life, I feel like I probably did this wrong or I probably did that wrong. But there's very few things where I can say I absolutely 100% know this was the right thing to do. And certainly, like most of the conflicts I've gotten into in my life, I can be like, okay, in this situation, I feel like I was kind of a victim and the other person was kind of, not really nice to me. And this other situation, I was kind of a jerk and probably the other person is a lot more in the right. But there's very few times I can look at a situation and be like, I was the good guy and they were the bad guy, or I was the bad guy and they were the good guy. And I think there's something really nice about being able to escape to a world where that's true, And I think that, to me, I think there's something problematic there, and I'm kind of glad that our heroes, especially today, don't do that as much. But I do think that that's a really powerful fantasy that a lot of people, myself included, often are really drawn to.
Sure. I mean, if you think about it, it's basically a well-written, long version, good graphics, good special effects of the 30-minute sitcom, right? 22-minute sitcom.
Oh, yeah.
You have a problem and you solve it. So, granted, this is a much better story, but the point is you get this sense of beginning, middle, and end, and this end is this conclusion where you are, for lack of better words, happy.
Right.
Good triumph over evil. Even though how harrowing it is. Every iconic type of story, there's this journey of these heroes, and they have to go through trials and tribulations. But in the end, they succeed.
Oh,
and and people really like that. I mean, Disney would not be around if that was not a true statement.
I mean, were you a fan of the Christopher Reeve Superman movies when you were a kid?
Oh my! I was a huge fan.
Oh,
it
yeah.
was
I went back and rewatched those, especially the first two a couple of years ago, and I still enjoy them.
Yeah.
I still really get a kick out of them, and I think Gene Hackman was a great Lex Luthor, and Zod from that second movie was just so good.
Absolutely.
But like you think about Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor, or particularly that General Zod in that second movie. Compare him to any villain in any of the modern, superhero movies. There is not a single redeeming thing about it. I mean, he's hysterically funny, and he's a great villain. But there isn't compare him to someone like Kingpin from Daredevil, or any of the you and I would even in Civil War, Colonel Zemo. Colonel Zemo, we get a little bit of that sense of his wife died in the attack on Sokovia, and we feel bad for him. There is never a moment where you feel bad for General Zod in Superman 2. He is the pure embodiment of evil, and Superman is a pure embodiment of good.
Yeah, no, of course. And I think that's one of the things that makes, Superman, the original Christopher Reeve Superman movie so classic, is that, this is when people think of Superman, they think of the old 1930s comics?
Oh, yeah, it started World War II.
Right. And you see him, in the classic bubblegum comic where he's like lifting up a truck or whatever, and stopping the bank robbers. And then, when you start thinking about different images of Superman, the image of Christopher Reeve comes up, not the new Supermans that you see in these new movies.
Oh, yeah.
Although it does bring up the point, though, I don't know if that's true for the new generation. Yeah. I don't know if they've watched the Christopher Reeves.
Well, and so here's my question, because let's get back to this idea of like the hero we relate to, because I think in a lot of ways for me that's in the end of the day, of all the different heroes I appreciate, it's the hero I relate to that I'm kind of going to be most drawn to.
Sure.
And I think like as I grew up, like I loved the Christopher Reeve, and as a 6-year-old I could relate to that because I could like throw a blanket over my back and run around the living room and pretend I was flying.
Of course.
Much to the horror of my mother and our nice furniture. But I really couldn't, once I, like you said, once I hit puberty and I was having trouble, like I didn't think even Clark Kent had any of the troubles I was having. But someone like Spider-Man does, or someone like some of the more modern heroes absolutely do. And so for you, like, as you look at some of those modern heroes, do you think, is it easier for you to relate to them?
Yeah, I would say that it's easier to relate to them, and especially as an adult, because these are adult characters. It does beg the question, though, superhero characters, at least when you think about them, these are cartoon, these are fantasy, these are usually for, children. Right. But these, if you think about today's Marvel movies and the trials and tribulations that these heroes are going through, I don't think that's Saturday morning cartoon.
Oh, I think we've gone, and I would even say we went a long way from that some time ago. I'll admit I didn't get into this for a long time because of this, but Paul, I don't know if he is an evangelist to you, but he was an evangelist to me for a long time about Batman the Animated Series and just how wonderful that show was.
Can I just as a side note, because courtesy of Netflix, I've actually watched all the Batman cartoons and Justice League and everything. It's a great watch late night and stuff. So I can see what he appreciates.
Yeah, I mean, and that's because like the thing is, by the time I got to high school, I think, I was probably the least sort of comic book guy of our group of friends, and I used to tease you guys a little bit because I thought I was like, this, I was going to college and I was reading big books. And I didn't want to do kid stuff. And in some ways I still thought of that stuff as kid stuff. I loved the Batman movies because they seemed much darker and much deeper. And then I finally went back and I rewatched that Batman the Animated Series. And it is a much more adult. I mean, it is clearly like for kids on some level, but I feel like there's also a lot more adult themes in it than I ever would have thought possible. And then you watch some of the stuff coming out now, like some of the DC shows they're on, CW, the WB or the CW or whatever, CW, or like Luke Cage or some of the other Netflix shows. I mean, those are just straight up like adult level, like serious drama stuff.
Right, but it's interesting. So you talk about Arrow and Luke Cage and all these type of things, and they're definitely more Daredevil, much more darker for an adult audience. But you could see that DC tried to bring back a more younger audience, and they went a little more campy because it was a campy character with the Flash.
Right.
And if I remember the ratings, I stopped watching after season 2, but I think season 3 to season 4 isn't doing very well. Like it's just like people don't really. In today's society, don't really connect with the original, superhero campiness or comic bookish.
I'm not sure that's true. I don't have the ratings in front of me. I think though Flash has been very successful, but I'd say because it's sort of what you're talking about, but a little different because in a lot of ways to me, Flash really captures what you were saying you loved about Spider-Man.
Yes.
Because it is campier certainly than Arrow or some of the darker stuff, but I think it's very funny, but it's also very relatable. I mean, Barry Allen is like he's a dork socially. He is pretty much completely incompetent when it comes to women. He's often like screwing things up socially or with his family. I mean, it's that same kind of way of like I look at Superman and I don't see anything I can relate to. I look at Barry Allen and I see someone who has superpowers I do. But even with his superpowers, he still has some of the social issues that I have, and so I feel like I can really relate to him.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. I never made the relation to Barry Allen to Peter Parker. There is a lot of similarities to that. That's very true.
I think so, definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's, but I think you're right. It's like I think we're in a really interesting time where we're trying to find what does a new idea of the hero mean, you know?
Right.
And I know you were saying that Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. has been one of your favorites. So what are you kind of seeing in that show about the idea of what does it mean to be a hero?
Well, the thing is, what I really liked about Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., particularly the first 3 seasons, I haven't started watching the Ghost Rider stuff, but I really liked it that these were just people. And, you know, and they're basically forced as their government agency type theme show and everything. They have to deal with, you know, the unknown superheroes, the unknown, you know, not quite X-File-ish, but they have to deal with all this. And they do it a little tongue in cheek because if you've seen one Alien, you've seen them all.
Right.
But the point is, but I think it's really interesting that it always comes down to they have to get the job done. No one will ever know they exist, but they're the good guys. In fact, a lot of times they tell in the show we're the good guys. Like They just blatantly say it, and I think the show has because the characters are so human, having to deal with a superhuman situations. Like I think it gives a real good sense of reality. Like I remember. In college, I ran this game. It was part of vampire tabletop games, but there was a thing basically where yada, 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 you're a human and then you get powers. But the point is, it's gothic horror. So if you, Matt Fox, were walking down the street and then all of a sudden you saw a vampire feeding on someone, and in that instant, you realized that vampires and ghosts and everything were real, like what would you do? And when I ran the game, I think like three of my players just like lost it. They like pictured what their real life people would do, and they just went to like a psych evaluation. They couldn't handle it. Yeah. So you know, it's like
You mean that the characters, you didn't actually send 3 people?
No.
Okay, just making sure we're clear.
No. They were playing themselves, and it was the constant deal was if you were really there, what would you do? And they were very honest with each other. So they're like, yeah.
And I think you're right. I especially love how you're connecting that game to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. because I think I like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I think for very similar reasons. And one of the biggest ones I think is that, you know, the show sort of gets at the idea of like Captain America gets the headlines. You know, Tony Stark gets the headlines. But in actuality, there's a lot of grunt work that needs to be done. You know, like and it. I think often when we say the word hero, one of the things we think is that we think a hero is 1 in a million. You know, a hero is the person who does the thing that is talked about for 500 years. And so much of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is, you know, these guys aren't. I mean, some of them later have superpowers, but a lot of them are just kind of like workaday agents in this agency trying to do the best they can. And it's sort of a very different idea of a hero. You know, a hero who's in the shadows, not necessarily because they're hiding the way like Batman's in the shadows, but just because they're one of a larger number, you know, and their powers aren't as great, but the things they're doing are still very needed and are no less heroic in that way.
You know, the Coast Guard saves people from drowning, right?
Yeah.
So,
but
you know,
they don't
who
get
talks about, yeah.
Yeah, like that's heroic, but it certainly doesn't get the attention that anything else does.
Right. So, you know, these are the type of things that actually I'm glad that we got a chance to talk today. I've been really thinking a lot about like, who are like real heroes, like not superheroes, because, you know, back in the day, if you go through the generations, like, you know, actually, if you go backwards, so I think that people are really associating more and more with superheroes because of the mainstream media and how it associates.
Right.
But and if you go back further, you know, I remember as a kid, people had all the sports players as really their heroes because they wanted to be like them. And then when you go back even earlier, before our time, I mean, all the civil rights people in the 70s and those types of people, and then go back further, and then you eventually get down to like, you know, Joe Policeman and Fred the Fireman. You're like, these are people who
and soldiers. I mean, like to our grandparents, I think like the people who had been war heroes. I mean, in some ways, like Captain America, like came out of that. But you know, it was the cowboys in the Old West, and it was these real life. But I think you're right. There's been an evolution away from just the soldiers into more like sports figures or political figures.
Right.
And now celebrities. I mean, celebrities became heroes in a way that I think is both good and kind of problematic.
You know what? It's interesting. I find that certain celebrities earn their right to be a hero because every celebrity at one time was just an actor, and then they made it. So they make money, they do their arts, they're performing, and the society says you get a lot of money for this.
Right.
But it's those people when they couldn't afford 2 nickels to rub together. Now when they have all this money, I don't know what proportion, but they're putting that back.
Right. What are they doing with that money?
Right.
So yes,
that to me.
Let's talk about that a little more. Like, what in this modern day, like to you, what makes a real life hero?
I think a real life hero is someone who helps people. Mm-hmm. I think that is a very important thing. I think someone who gives people something to aspire to. If you have someone who's a hero and does something, whatever, something heroic, and then someone else does 10% of that, and you're like, whatever, giving to the needy or helping someone in need, then even if it's just 10% of what this hero did, that's still 10% more than you wouldn't have done if you weren't inspired by this person.
Right.
So I think that's what really makes a hero, someone who inspires.
Yeah. No, I can totally see that. And I think that's a really good point. I think it's we see it with our celebrities a lot, and I think it's I think of like people who become heroes, like even just for a moment, like that guy Sully, who was the I think that's his name, right? Yeah, because the movie he was the pilot who like I think a bird got caught in the engine and he landed the plane in this like heroic way. And, for a couple of months, he was like the big hero who everybody was talking about. I'm never going to land a plane. You're never going to probably land a plane. Certainly not with that many people in it. Neither of us is ever going to replicate that. But I think, but when he gets talked about as a hero, it's that idea of like the calm under pressure. Hero is a person who he was in a situation where a number of people, he was responsible for their lives, for their safety, and he was able to do the heroic thing in that moment. And so what did it mean for him to be able to, like, yeah, we can't relate to him in terms of we're never going to fly a plane, but what can we look to from that idea of like, what does it mean to have that calm in, to not panic in that situation, to not, just dive out of the plane yourself, but to keep the responsibility and to maintain it, to be able to help others.
Right. He was a living example of what you wish you would do in that situation.
Right. Totally. Well,
right.
And I think with the superhero stuff, it gets very interesting because as you and I were talking about a little bit before, and I'd love to go into more, I think we're now starting to see like not only are people today asking that like, Captain America is a superhero, but they're talking about Chris Evans as a superhero, like the line of like Tony Stark being a hero versus Robert Downey Jr. as a hero. Like, yeah, we're looking to the actors who portray these people. And I think that it feels kind of weird, but also there's a lot of awesome potential for heroism there. Would love to like, so what are you kind of thinking when you see like Chris Evans doing something, on Twitter or talking about like using his power as the person who plays Captain America to like try to do good?
Okay, so in that case, I think that is very heroic, and that's a good idea because he is using his popularity to make a message out there to help people. Right. Now that obviously, like in any story, he could use his popularity for quote unquote evil. So he's using it to help people. Right. So that in itself is heroic. However, I think it's a very interesting point that these two particular characters, Tony Stark and Captain America, Robert Downey Jr., Chris Evans, is they basically, I think the public, and this is probably due to having very good agents. They don't people. They're treating them as one and the same. Yeah. Like these are like I wonder how many people remember that Chris Evans was the Human Torch. So that was so.
I think he hopes very few, but yes.
Right. So the point being is that. So these people are like, I want Chris Evans is my hero, but when they think that, I think they're thinking Captain America.
Oh yeah,
and
I remember I think I have the two people right, but I think it was last year's Super Bowl. I know Chris Evans was one, and I think Christopher Pratt, the guy who played Star-Lord, was the other. Like, each of them was really rooting for one of the teams in the Super Bowl. And they made a bet that whichever team lost, that person had to dress up as their character and then go to a children's hospital in the other one's city, you know? So, like, if the team that Chris Evans loved lost the Super Bowl, then Captain America would go visit the kids in the hospital of the city that had won the Super Bowl. I may be getting the details wrong, but I thought it was both fantastic, but it was really interesting what you're saying, because it was like the way the media was portraying it was like, well, is Chris Evans making this bet with Christopher Pratt, or is Star-Lord making this bet with Captain America, you know?
Right.
And it was a very interesting, like, the blurring of the lines, because each of them was clearly using the fact that they are kind of the voice of this iconic fictional character to be a hero as a real person in real life.
Yeah, and that comes down to, like, a lot of times when you can analyze it and cross-analyze it, and is it the pros and cons, but in the end, he's helping kids in a hospital. So to me, that's heroic. In this, I don't want to say. I guess you could say the ends do justify the means, because if he was still a struggling actor, he couldn't offer that service to those kids.
Right. No, yeah, To me, it's not even as much a like in ends justify the means thing. Like I definitely look at it and I see it's a great thing, but I think it's interesting that we're because like I think you and I were talking about this a bit beforehand. Right. Like, these guys are still human beings, like what happens when we find out that, like, one of the actors who is playing one of these characters, like,
cheats on his taxes or something. Yeah,
cheats on his taxes, or cheats on his wife, or hits his wife, or has a husband, not a wife, which shouldn't, like, to me is just as heroic, just as awesome and wonderful, but it is going to cause some people to get upset. They shouldn't, but, like, it's going to happen. I think one of the things that I think actually some of these movies have really well explored is what are the problems when we put our heroes up on pedestals. And I kind of think that when the actors who play the heroes are also put on pedestals, then this happens even more, Like, because it's like, what do you do when, like, if the person who plays one of these heroes isn't really a good guy in person, like, if we really associate that person with that thing, then what does that mean? How will it affect it if we see they're not that great a person?
Right. I mean, if you think about it, these are still just, first of all, they're actors, and they're Hollywood famous actors. The amount of events, parties, clubs, whatever that these people might, you're basically, Chris Evans is basically, unless he becomes the true Boy Scout, not Captain America, but Chris Evans becomes the Boy Scout, someone's going to catch a picture or a video of him doing something quite human. Right. And it's going to discolor people's view of what he's trying to do, because we put him on this pedestal because we associate it with this iconic character.
And I wonder if in some ways that here's a place where we need to kind of do with the actors of heroes the same thing we've already done with the heroes themselves, because we were talking before about how we kind of like the fact that now, like, Tony Stark is an alcoholic and is suffering from PTSD, but can still be heroic. He doesn't have to be perfect. Like, and I wonder if on some level we need to start being willing to say it's great when the actors who play the heroes we love do great things, but they don't have to be perfect. Like you mentioned before that when you and I were growing up, sports figures were a lot of our favorite heroes. Like, I remember Charles Barkley. Charles Barkley was, I still think, one of the greatest basketball players to ever play the game, a fantastic rebounder. And, like, I think he's the kind of guy who I think I would love to, like, get a drink with and hang out with at a party. But if you were to, like, make a list of, like, the top 10 good guys in the NBA, and I say that quote meaning that I think that is kind of a weird way to judge people, but by those kind of judgments, he's not at the top of the list, and he would be very clear about saying that. And he, very famously, he did a TV commercial where he said, like, listen, parents, your children watch me because I'm really good at dunking the ball and I'm really good at rebounding and I'm really good at playing defense. I'm not a role model to your children. Don't let your children watch me to figure out how to be better people. They should look to you as parents for that.
Cool.
And it was really controversial because a lot of people were like, no, you're a basketball player. You have to be the role model. And he was really saying, no, like I can be a basketball hero, but that don't put me up on that pedestal, And I think there's an interesting lesson for us there as we talk about what are superheroes teaching us about what does it mean to be a hero and what does it mean to look up to someone?
Well, actually, I think that's one of the original questions you asked. Like, what does it mean to be a hero? Like, what is your take on what does it mean to be a hero? Like, I vent about inspiring and looking for people to look up to. But, you mentioned as a growing up, your main hero was Batman. Like, so that's kind of a dark one, man. So what is your definition of a hero?
And it's hard because I think in a lot of ways, I feel like for me, a hero was someone who was wrestling with the same things I wrestle with and who like had the potential to make the wrong choices that I made, but still winds up making the right ones. And I think like for me, this is part of where I think Batman and to go back to what I was saying before, Star Wars really come together for me. Because to me, and here I'm going to kind of get into a little bit my own sort of like personal philosophy, but like I have always thought like I have a very sort of love-hate relationship with the idea of violence. Like I as a kid and like sword fights and laser fights, these all seemed great to me. But there was a part of me that always felt like, if you hate evil, that if you hate bad things, then you start telling yourself that it's okay to do bad things to bad people. And eventually like you start to become evil yourself, To me, this is the whole idea of the Star Wars movies and of that, like if you use hate to fight evil, you become the dark side.
Sure.
And I always thought that was sort of because like for me, I always wanted to do social justice work, but like, when I was like, well, I need to fight those, like I need to like, I would see like, people who are anti-civil rights. And I was like, no, we should just, all do like lock them up in jail, take away their civil rights when I was like 12 or 13. And my mother would be like, listen to yourself. You're saying like people are bad because they want to take away people's civil rights. And so we should, and so I was saying, take away their civil rights. And my mom was like, well, you're losing yourself there. And I think for me, that's why I love the Star Wars stories. And it's also why I loved Batman, because Batman to me is someone who he starts by saying we can't fight crime within the criminal justice system. It's too corrupt. It's too broken. It's too many problems. So we have to stop like being good guys in order to do good. But he's constantly having to wrestle with the fact that he's kind of opening Pandora's box a little bit, and he always has to wrestle with how does he make sure he doesn't open it too far? How does he not become Ra's al Ghul? How does he not become the Huntress or one of those other villains who, to some, like Poison Ivy on some level has the exact same idea that Batman does. She wants to do criminal things to make the world a better place. It's just that her idea of what the world a better place is seems pretty crazy to us.
Sure. Batman was always about, and it's in many, many episodes and many, many genres of the Batman is, you can't cross the line. And usually the line represents he can't kill, but sometimes they talk about other things.
Right.
But the idea is that he basically has to work outside the law in order to be the law. But there's a certain point he can't cross because then he becomes them.
Well, and I think here's the key is that, like, all of us in theory do that. We're all told, like, try to be a good person, but like, like it's good to like give money to the poor, but don't like go like rob a rich person and take his money and give it to the poor. Like we like Robin Hood, but we're not supposed like there's a rule we're not supposed to follow. We're supposed to follow. And for the most part, we all just sort of follow that rule. And I think but Batman is about saying, well, what if you have to find that line for yourself, instead of just following the line that everyone tells you to. And because I think you're right. I think Batman does try to hold to a line. But what's so interesting about the story is that it's not the line that people tell him to. He has to find that line for himself.
Yeah, that's true. I was just thinking, though, like, as Batman being a Batman being a hero, I can see what you're talking about. But I remember as a kid, I never really connected as well as Batman.
Yeah.
Very similarly, and I know this is blasphemy for you, I never really connected well with like the James Bond movies.
Okay.
Because he was like a rich. He could do all these things that we could never do. We can't afford a jet, film these things, So I couldn't really associate with this. Like they basically took a very human aspect of a person dealing with money and survival, and for characters like James Bond, Green Arrow, Batman, it was just a non-issue.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, on the emotional side, Batman had a lot of other things to deal with, but that one piece, it never not a thing.
Well, I would say two things there. One is, to be clear, I love the James Bond movies. I would never in a million years say James Bond is a hero. I mean,
fair enough.
James Bond is a womanizing sociopath.
I just remembered you love those movies.
Oh, yeah. Well, but that's the other thing, is that I feel like in a lot of ways, like I love them, but I wouldn't call him a hero. And I would even, and here I'm really hoping Paul will listen to this later and text in and start a discussion with us online about it. I'm not sure I'd call Batman a hero in the exact same way. Like I think he really blurs that line of what is a hero or an anti-hero, especially because I think like, Superman would say, "Hey, boys and girls, you should be like me." Like Batman is never going to go to Gotham Middle School and say like, "Hey, boys and girls, be like me." And so I think like we started at the beginning about like a hero is someone who people want to emulate. I feel like I can learn a lot about how to be a better person by Batman's example, but I don't know if Batman's a hero in the same way.
Fair enough. Okay. So, we were talking about, keep going back to DC, but Marvel has a lot of really good heroes and things like that. Are you really into the Daredevil and the Luke Cage and stuff? Because those are equally dark.
Oh yeah, I think of all of the things that are happening in the sort of superhero genre right now, I mean, I think all of it is fantastic. Some parts of Arrow are pretty bad, and like some of the WB stuff is fun, but it's not great. But like, I think what Netflix is doing with Jessica Jones and with Luke Cage and Daredevil, frankly, I think sets the bar for the best of any of the superhero genre. And frankly, I think it's just like, to me, Luke Cage and Daredevil, especially, and Jessica Jones, were just some of the best television I've seen in years.
Great.
So what about you? Where do you see those things?
So Jessica Jones and Daredevil, I definitely really like about the characters. I think sometimes in both of those, they take the fact that this is a dark show and then beat you on the head with it. So that was a little, that was a little thing. And then and Luke Cage, I watched most of the episodes, but I also feel like it was all over the place. Like I couldn't figure out, is this like a cop show? Is this like a trial by fire show? Is this a guy trying to, I understand what they were trying to do, but I think that like if you took each episode of Luke Cage by itself, very entertaining. But if you watch like a season, I remember when I watched it, I was like, I didn't have that edge ups and falls like where the story was going.
I'll admit I think Luke Cage is just one of the best things I've seen on television. Although I did think some of the later episodes were a little weak. But I do think in that, to me, Luke Cage isn't a superhero show. Luke Cage is an urban justice show about where a person in it has superpowers. And I think that maybe is one of the most. And I know we should wrap up pretty soon, but that maybe here's the last thing I want to ask about is, I would say, and I'm wondering if you would agree with this, that I feel like we're sort of starting to transcend the idea of superhero is a genre. To me, we like Ant-Man. Ant-Man to me isn't a superhero movie. Ant-Man's a caper movie. Like it's kind of like Ocean. To me, Ant-Man has more in common with Ocean's 11 than it does with Iron Man. It's just that the character also happens to have superpowers. And like, I think Luke Cage is the same thing. I think Luke Cage is in a lot of ways a show that like it's about like black city life. and that experience in a way that most other shows aren't. Someone in it has superpowers, but I don't think it means that show is like therefore the same as Daredevil. And I think if we're getting to the point where a superhero you can have a character that's a hero in a show or movie, but it doesn't have to be about that. Like, I think that's actually pretty awesome.
Okay, so then let me. Since we're running out of time, I wanted to throw something back at you. As a kid, you got stuff out of comics and cartoons and superheroes in general.
Right.
But now that today's shows are hitting these more real / dark aspects, there's some mix and match. But now picture kids today. So picture the 13-year-old, 12-year-old, whatever. They're watching these shows today. Like, what are they getting out of them as heroes? It's not as good, evil, black and white as when we were kids. So, do you think this is better or worse?
It's a good question, and I'll admit I'm not a parent, so I don't know. I've had some, like I taught Sunday school some, and part of what got me thinking about this blog to begin with was talking to friends of mine who were involved in churches, and they were talking about how could they use these figures to raise like interesting questions for Sunday school. And I would say, like, I don't know enough about kids' entertainment today to know if there is something out there that's the equivalent of the sort of Superman, like when the Christopher Reeve Superman, where it's just such clear black and white good and evil.
Right.
And maybe there is. I just don't know. But I kind of think it's good that there isn't, Like, I mean, I think, like, I look at, like, the Harry Potter books and movies or some things like that, where, it's pretty clear Voldemort is just straight up evil. But even then, like, you kind of identify a little bit with Tom Riddle at a few points. You see Tom Riddle is certainly a lot easier to relate to than General Zod. So yeah, I would say that I think for the most part it's good, but I can also understand kids and especially parents being a little frustrated that everything is so cynical. What about you? How do you see it?
I think I think what it comes down to is because they realize that it sells.
Well, I think that's definitely true.
Yeah. Every show is all about it's a gray world. It's not black and white, and everything is always gray. And when we first started having this conversation, we were talking about how satisfying it is to have a definite good and bad at the end. Right. And actually, you know what? I'll take that back. I think whoever are the writers, they basically say it's gray all the time, but at the very beginning of a season and at the very end of the season, you'll see this, good. So basically, they figured out that it's a better cash cow if they take the good, the good and evil, and they just stick it at the ends of the seasons, as opposed to at the end of each episode.
And I would say, go ahead.
No, and I think that's smart. It gives you more realism.
Yeah.
But it's like reading a book. You got a beginning and end.
Yeah.
So.
And I'll say, like, I do, one of the episodes that Paul and I did a while ago was on the movie Desperado, which I think you're a big fan of the way we are. Yeah. And part of what we were talking about was the idea of vengeance and how, like, I think we were both pretty, like, sort of ethically committed to the idea, or, like, I shouldn't say that about Paul, but, like, for me at least, like, I was talking about how, like, in a general thing, I think, like, vengeance, like, being satisfied by vengeance isn't really a good feeling. And, like it feels good, but that's not necessarily a healthy thing. And having a sense of, like, yeah, I don't like that guy. He's a bad guy. So I want to, like, enjoy seeing him, like, terribly murdered. That's not a healthy feeling, but it is enjoyable sometimes. And every now and then, like, you like a movie like Desperado because you get to kind of revel in that. And I do think in the same way, I guess to me, I don't think it's a great idea. For the most part, I'm not a big believer in moral absolutes. I made this podcast because I love talking about these things, and I love the idea of, like, that there's a lot of moral gray. There's a lot more moral gray than we want to admit. But I do think that every now and then that kind of moral, like, clear, bright lines is very satisfying. And so, yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with having a couple of, actual Christopher Reeve level General Zods out there. Right. I just think it's good that that's not the majority anymore.
See, for me, is that I think that the gray makes a better story, but if you're looking for heroes, it's much harder. And that was the topic of our conversation,
Yeah.
finding the heroes.
Yeah. Well,
You know,
let me ask you this, though. Is it that it's harder or that it changes? Because I think you're right. It is harder to find a Christopher Reeve Superman kind of hero. But isn't it easier in some ways to find a Peter Parker hero in a world like that, where because there is a lot more gray and there is a lot more hard decisions that you have to relate to?
No, I would change the definition of gray then, because Peter Parker had trials and tribulations that people can relate to, poverty, all bad relationships and everything like that. But I think today's, especially with like Jessica Jones and Daredevil, these are like violence and very real psychological issues that these people are going through. And I think those are very important to talk about with today's adults and bringing it into the mainstream media to show that it's a real thing. So if you talk about a story and to teach those type of lessons, fantastic.
Right.
But if you're like a kid or someone growing up looking for a hero, I don't know. I don't know if that's really where I would go.
See, so I think there's a really interesting question there, and I think I can see it both sides. I definitely hear where you're coming from. But I also think, in some ways, to me, a hero can be the person who is caught in the mire of that and can still find a way to do the good thing.
Sure.
Well, and so let me ask you this as kind of a last question. In some ways, I feel like Spider-Man in the Civil War movie, he was the innocent. He was younger than everybody else. He did, he sort of was totally just like whatever Mr. Stark said, he believed. He didn't really get wrapped up in all this stuff about is Tony right or is Captain right? He was able to really just sort of believe, Tony Stark's a hero. He's telling me what I should do. This is the law. I should do it. And I feel like in some ways he is still kind of that innocent hero you're talking about. What do you want to see happen in the new Spider-Man movie that's coming out? Do you want to see him sort of stay kind of like a little more innocent than everybody else in this world, or do you want to see him be just as kind of like morally jaded as everybody else in the Marvel world right now?
Well, I mean, Spider-Man is the innocent, and what the movies are doing because of the licensing of Spider-Man jumping from studio to studio, they're basically running the story of Spider-Man at different ages, which is the same story. He was going out of college with Tobey Maguire, and then in the other two movies he was in high school, and now he's like 13. So, he's going to be getting a very different sense of growing up, but growing up with the powers of a superhero.
Right.
So you're if you're asking, he's going to look for other heroes like Captain America or Iron Man because of technology and brains and stuff, and he's going to have to, find out, as he grows up from, a boy into a man, he's going to make his decisions, but he's not going to be as American as Captain America is. Right. Captain America's I'm just this good person, and the super serum made me 1,000 times equal to my goodness in my heart. And Spider-Man, because he's Spider-Man, he's a good kid. And the question is, I don't want to see him turn dark. I mean, granted, it'll make a great story. I remember in the comics when he turns with the black costume Spider-Man, or when gets buried alive with Kraven. There's some really dark stuff. But in the end, he still comes back to being that good kid who does the things because it's the right thing to do. Right. And he never. And the really interesting thing is until Spider-Man comics got into the very late comics where he's like a man, he did all the good things because it was the right thing to do, but he didn't have speeches. He didn't know why he was doing it. He wasn't like the iconic Captain America when the world tells you to move and you say, no, you move. He didn't have any of that stuff. He's like, I'm out of here, webs away, and he just disappears. So, but he always did the good thing. Yeah. So, it's different.
It is, and I think especially as we talk about this, I'm now really curious what will happen in his new movie, because especially as you were talking, I feel like both Tony Stark and, Steve Rogers, Captain America and Iron Man, each of them has sort of a guiding principle. For Captain America, it's, you stand by what you believe is right. And for Tony Stark, it's someone has to be watching, someone has to be in control, and authority makes sense. And I feel like Spider-Man could really easily go either way with those. Like, he could be pulled in either direction. And I think in some ways, what I would really love to see is the story that's about him, not even about being like, is he dark and cynical or innocent, but really just, as you said, the Civil War movie was, you were able to watch the Civil War movie and sort of see that both sides have a point. And I feel like Peter Parker Spider-Man is the person who would be most able to kind of going forward keep seeing that both of them have a point,
Right.
And I think
and
that can make a great story. Go ahead.
Just on one thing on that is that I think that, Tony Stark is not all about, must follow the rules and everything like that. It's at a lower level, which Peter Parker will really associate with, which makes me really agree with your statement, is that Tony Stark has a over a sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
He created all those weapons, and we all know Spider-Man's responsibilities phrase.
Oh, no, exactly.
So the point is, I think that, he could really go either way. With Tony Stark with like, you have these powers, you are responsible for them. Or he could be like, I am a good person and I'm trying to do what is right. No matter, everyone picks on me because I'm the little guy. Everyone hates Spider-Man, but I'm still going to do the right thing. So he's going to, go towards Captain America. So it's either, it's interesting. So I don't know. I thought that was interesting. So this has been a really interesting conversation. I think we barely scratched the surface on a lot of this stuff.
I mean, on all of these, I always sort of feel like there's so much more we could talk about. But thank you again. There's been a great conversation.
No problem.
I'll be putting this up in a day or two, and I hope certainly to all those people who are listening, tell us what you think. What makes a hero? Who are the heroes you really followed growing up? Who are the heroes you believe in today? Who are the people you don't think of as heroes, either in real life or in the superhero world? We'd love to hear about it. Adam, please, check in with us on Twitter, on Facebook. I'm sure there'll be a lot of, I hope there's going to be some discussion about this podcast going forward. Any kind of last things you want to say?
Not really. Like the time went by so fast, but when we had some side conversations, we talked about, real life superheroes, like who, so I would think it'd be really interesting if people who listen to this podcast, we talked a lot about the superheroes and everything out there. I'm just really curious who people out there, what are people's real life heroes?
Yeah.
Like, who's, someone mentioned Elon Musk. I thought that was really an interesting idea. And then I think you mentioned how certain actors, like we talked about, go to the hospitals and help people. So that, even though they're playing these characters, they are real people helping people. So I'm curious what other people think about who are some real heroes out there.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I thought was kind of awesome is I think it's Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie who first started this, but I'm sure others have done it, where they realized that whatever they did, sort of paparazzi were going to follow them around and take pictures of them. So they started saying like, all right, well, why don't we just start carrying signs to like get, things, if you're going to take a picture of me, you're going to take a picture of me holding a sign that says like, think about, children dying in this earthquake in Southeast Asia or whatever it is. Like, they've done this, and like Mark Ruffalo is doing that right now with the Dakota pipeline issue, like using that celebrity or, but it could be that, it could be Elon Musk, it could be Warren Buffett, it could be, for other people all the way on the other end, it could be Ted Nugent. I mean, like there's all these people who could be your hero, Clint Eastwood. So yeah, folks, if you're listening, let us know what you think. Talk to us on Twitter at Superhero Ethics on Twitter. Search for the Superhero Ethics Podcast on iTunes, or you can find us at superheroethics.com. On behalf of myself, on behalf of Adam, on behalf of Paul, who can't be with us today, thanks everybody for taking part, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.